Hey everyone, I'm back again for another really simple, easy, everyday style 100% whole grain sourdough bread recipe. This is a lovely one and something a bit unique. It's made with spelt, and you can see the spelt in there, and modern hard white wheat and millet. I don't know what type of millet it is exactly. We don't get that detail much in Australia, but I'm pretty sure it's like pearl millet. It's the yellow millet type variety. And I don't know if you can see there, but I've got some sesame seeds that I put in with the flour as well. I decided to film this after I had started milling it, so I apologize for that. I didn't give you the close-up of the grain, but you get the idea. There's the spelt, just a bit of a close up. I ended up using up all of the millet. That was the whole point of the recipe, was to use up all the millet. So I can't give you a close up of that, but this is the lovely spelt grain. If you don't have a mill and you're not using freshly milled flour, that's totally okay. Just use store-bought flour. Just know that you might need a bit less water if you use store-bought flour. And this is the hard white wheat that I'm using. You can see how different that is compared to the spelt, which is an ancient wheat grain. That's the Scout. It's a beautiful kind of all-purpose hard white wheat from Burrum Biodynamics in Victoria in Australia. So this is a really simple recipe. Because I use millet in this, it is a gluten-free grain. So when I tend to make these kind of hybrid loaves with some wheat grains and some gluten-free flours, I tend to add psyllium husk, and that is to help bind the dough. I used a quarter of a cup of psyllium husk. This is a really big loaf. It's an 800 gram flour loaf, and so a quarter a cup of psyllium husk is fairly modest really for the amount of flour that I've got. And I'm just adding the salt there, so that's 14 grams of salt. So that's 400 grams of spelt flour, 200 grams of millet, and 200 grams of hard white wheat. So 1/4 of this flour is a non-gluten grain. And it made a really lovely bread. I like these sort of hybrid loaves. Once you've got all of your dry ingredients mixed, I like to just make a well in the center of my flour, and that's a good spot to pour your water into. And because this is kind of a low gluten hybrid dough, and I'm using all that psyllium husk, I make this with 100% hydration. You might want to try a bit less. So that's 800 grams of water for the 800 grams of flour that I'm using. You really do have to experiment because all of the grains, all of the flours, they differ quite a lot. And this is my sourdough starter, Boris, straight out of the fridge. You can tell he's been there for a while. He's looking a little bit sad, but it's fine. It does a fine job for raising the loaf of bread, and I'm only putting in about 100 grams and just leave a little bit left in my jar, so it's not a huge amount of starter. It's just a really good minimal basic amount to leaven the bread. Once you've got the starter and the water, I just sort of mix them together in the middle a little bit first, and then as they start to dissolve and get mixed through, I start to incorporate all the rest of the dry ingredients. And just keep on mixing those. I don't know what it is about these kinds of loaves. I think I really enjoy making them because they're easy. You just stir them, basically. Stir them and then let them ferment. There's no stretch and folds. There's no point stretching and folding a dough like this. You just mix it. It's a really wet batter. It does thicken up as it sits, which you will see. And it thickens up as you stir it too, because the psyllium does soak up water fairly quickly. But just mix it through in a bowl really thoroughly. I like to get my spatula in there and make sure that I've got all the dry flour off the bottom of the bowl. You can see I'm picking up a bit there, so my spoon mixing wasn't super thorough. You can use a hand mixer for this too. You could use a stand mixer if you wanted to, but it's such a sticky dough, I don't think you really need it. You're not really doing any gluten development, you're just hydrating all of the flour. That's the main goal of it. Scrape down the sides of your bowl, that's really helpful. It helps cleaning up the bowl later, makes that a lot easier. And then make sure you cover it for the fermentation so that your dough doesn't dry out. Once that's done, I feed up my starter for next time. This is my little jar that holds 500 grams of flour, and this is the only flour that I pre-mill. And I do this just for convenience. You can mill extra flour each time you make a loaf if you want to feed your starter fresh flour, but I just use this little jar full of hard white wheat flour, and I find that's just a bit easier. It's obviously not super fresh, but it's only a few weeks old at the maximum, and it works really well to keep my starter healthy. So I feed my starter up with 50 grams each of water and flour and just mix that through. You saw before that I only just had a little sort of scraping left in the bottom of the jar, and that's enough to inoculate the next batch of starter. And I scrape down the sides of my starter jar as well. I've been doing it this way for, I don't know, 15 years or so now, a long time, and just keeping the sides of your jar and everything clean. It just, I never wash those jars. They just get used again and again and again. And it all works if you just use those few little tricks to help prevent any mold on the side of the jar. This was a spring day. It was a fairly cool day. I left this for 9 hours, and look at it at the end of the day in the afternoon. Holy dooly, that is just the most gorgeous dough. I love looking at that. This is beautifully fermented. You can clearly see all of the bubbles in that dough. It is definitely ready to shape and then do the final proof and bake. And my starter has all jumped up as well. It's all reactivated, so I just put it back into the fridge for the next bake then, and that's all I do. I do have videos on this sourdough starter maintenance method if you want to check those out. It's pretty basic really. That's all I do. Just leave it out for the day alongside the dough and then pop it in the fridge, and it's ready to go for next time. Because this was such a large loaf, I decided to proof it inside a large metal baking dish or bread pan, and then I put it onto some non-stick baking paper inside the pan, and then I use that to lift it into a preheated ceramic baker, which you'll see soon. So I don't always do it this way. You can just bake it straight in a pan if you want to. I just find that I do get a really much improved oven spring in my loaves when I bake them in a preheated pot of some sort, but it is a bit of a hassle, and you don't have to use paper. You could use a banneton if you wanted to, but I find the paper easier to transfer the dough. And these doughs are not strong, they don't have a lot of resilience. You want to be careful when you're transferring them when they're proofed. So I find the paper method very easy. So this metal pan here, I'm just using that like a banneton, I guess, just to hold the dough while it proofs, and then I'm going to transfer it into my hot ceramic baker when it's ready to bake. You'll notice I sprayed the paper with water as well, and I sprayed the bench with water. That just stops anything from sticking to it. And for the final proof, which on this day, it was a cool spring day. I filmed this in last September actually, here in Brisbane. The final proof was close to 2 hours. So this is, about 2 hours after I shaped it. And it doesn't look like it's risen dramatically, but it doesn't need to be. Whole grain sourdough bread making is completely different to yeast bread baking, and often what you're going to look for are much more subtle cues for when your dough is ready to bake. But I judged that this one was getting close, so I put my big Emile Henry clay baker in the oven and preheat that to about 220 Celsius, so that's a pretty hot oven. You can see all the smoke coming out of this. It was very, very hot, and I think it had a little bit of oil or something left in there, which is why it was smoking. But I just spray a bit of water on top of my dough. That's really just to add a little bit of extra steam inside the pot. And I had a bit of trouble getting it out of that pan, but eventually I got there. And then also spraying the water on the paper and the dough stops the paper from sticking to the dough. So it helps you kind of push out those wrinkles and get your paper sitting really nicely, so that you don't get paper marks too badly in your bread. You still get some, but it won't be too bad. So you definitely use the water trick. It adds nice steam to your bread and helps everything to not stick. And that hot pot then goes into the oven for 30 minutes, just on that really high temperature, about 220 Celsius. And this is the bread after 30 minutes when I take the lid off. It's not finished, but it's looking very good. You can see I'm pretty happy with it there. There's no dramatic ear or broken crust or anything like that. These are fairly dense kind of loaves, but they're very, very tasty and super nutritious and really easy. So after the lid came off, I left that go for another 10 or 15 minutes, I think, until it was nice and brown on the top. And then once it's really, really brown and looking good, you can take it out of the paper and be happy with your bread. It definitely did smell very good. All of my bakes smell good. Some of them don't look as good as others, but they all smell good, which is one good thing. I just pulled the paper out, which came out surprisingly well that time, which was good. And then tip out the loaf, and there you have it. A very sturdy looking 100% whole wheat, spelt and millet sourdough loaf. I always give my breads the little knock test on the bottom to make sure they sound nice and firm and cooked inside. And here it is the next day. This is what it looks like on the inside. Remember, this has got a quarter of a cup of psyllium husk in it, which is about 20 grams of psyllium in an 800 gram flour loaf. So it does leave that little tacky residue on my knife, but I'm not bothered about that. Don't worry about that. It's not a bad thing if that happens. It just means you've got well hydrated bread, which I personally prefer for my whole grain sourdough loaves. And this bread, especially with the sesame seeds in it, tastes absolutely amazing. It's just got the best of everything, really. So you can use this method and have fun with it, and try this with other grains as well. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time. Bye.